I'm Jim Knight, co founder of the Instructional Coaching Group, and you're listening to Coaching Conversations, where I talk with coaching experts from around the world so that all of us can learn better ways to make an unmistakably positive impact on the people around us. Michael, it's so great to see you, and I'm going to embarrass you with a few words about your impact on me. And it was, I think, 1992 when I walked into your office. The first thing I did is I took a course with you and Barry Bennett. I don't know if you remember this.
I remember you took a course with me. You did walk into my office and said you wanted to take a course. Just name the books that you should read, and we'll talk about them one by one. So that's how we got started.
Well, I read at that point, that's when you were writing Change Forces. So I read just about everything you'd written up until Change Forces came out. My job when the independent study was to show up with a summary of it, and then we would talk about it. Sometimes you took me out to lunch. And you introduced me to a lot of people, Seymour Saracen,
Yeah.
Margaret Wheatley, probably most importantly, Peter Senge and Peter Block. Peter Block's work really influenced my thinking about how we do coaching.
Yeah.
And then I would show up. I don't know if you know this, but I would show up and meet you periodically at OISE when you're director of OISE. And I would record the conversations because you were so smart. And the way you talked, I had to slow down the tape and listen to it to keep track of what I learned as I went through it. And it was you who pointed me towards Corwin. And, Sengi's work was instrumental in my thinking when I went to the University of Kansas to do my doctorate. You also wrote a letter that got me, I think, had a big element to do in terms of getting my scholarship. I got a Shirk scholarship for my doctorate. And many, many ways, you continue to influence my thinking. And sometimes I'll hear you say something and I'll go, oh, that's exactly what I think. And then, well, of course, because I've read all your books, I've had a fair bit of impact. I think total, there's something like 500,000 books have been sold that I've written. And as I say all the time, they wouldn't have existed without you. What Dizzy Gillespie said about Louis Armstrong, know him, know me. That's the way I feel your work. Aside from my wife, Don Deschler, my advisor, you're probably the person who's had the greatest influence on me, and not just me, the whole world of education. So I'm excited to
Well,
talk.
that's great to know, and you never know what kind of influence you have, but that's you if you capture what's happening in the world and feed it back in you know ways that reveal the what I call the nuances, then you have an impact.
Right, right. Well, I thought what we could do today is we could look through. You've just released the 6th edition of the New Meaning of Educational Change. So I thought we could look at each one briefly to kind of chronicle your evolution and your thinking. And then talk about the 6th, and then talk about new things that are happening, and maybe look ahead to the future. What do you think? What do you see
Yeah, I
coming?
think the latter chapters of the new book are really talking about the present slash future because that we're just in the midst of it. So that is real writing in real time. So there's no like implications. The implications are embedded in those uh, in the last chapter and the epilogue. But yes.
So it was the 1st edition. Now, you said in the new book that you got the idea of flying on a 5-hour flight from Toronto to Toronto. So tell us about where the idea for the meaning of educational change came.
Yeah, I would say first of all that I got off to a slow start, even though obviously I'm accelerated after that. But I when I started in 1968, I came straight with my PhD. My supervisor Jan Loopser took the job as the first chair of the sociology and education department at OISE. So he went and walked a couple of blocks from the University of Toronto to there. He said, "You want to come as I'm just opening a department and it's sociology and education, and we don't have any staff. Do you want to be the first one?" So that's how I got started. But I didn't know anything about educational change. My dissertation was on workers' receptivity to innovation and the role of technology. We looked at the automobile industry, glass making, looked at oil refinery, variations from craftsman or craftspersonship to automation at the time. This was around 1970. So that's how I got started. And to get to the meaning of change, I actually had a slow start because I didn't know anything. So as a new department, we didn't have a lot of demands. We were starting a building, so I spent quite a bit of time doing sort of getting into schools, looking at things. I wasn't really moving very fast, one could say. But I guess the best way to describe it is I noticed when I wrote the new book and I said, okay, 1982, that book, and the meaning of change was in 1982 was the first book I'd written. Because most of the other books I was writing parallel books. Yeah, that's how you get to 60. You write a lot of other ones, but they weren't at the front end. They were after I knew something. So the interesting thing about the first book is it was my first book. It was um, 20 years after I started my job as assistant professor, which was 1968. So 12, maybe 14, 15 years. So I got to that point and I was doing a lot of field work. We were interacting with Milby McLaughlin and Paul Berman in the RAND change agent studies, that stuff that we knew, Ron Havelock, people that were the pioneers of innovation in education. And so I was interacting. It was with the Far West Lab, which was one of the 20 labs across the U.S. that were uh, spurning innovation, supposedly. And we were talking frequently about it. There was lots of, at the time, adoption of innovations, building on the work that was really in farms and fertilizer. Everett Rogers did the adoption studies and that. Anyway, to make a long story short, uh, when I when I was at that meeting at the Far West Lab and I got on the plane to come home to Toronto, I I I was thinking, well, I should write a book sooner because I'm 40 years old and I'm a rookie still. So I did have the notion just when I realized that all the stuff we're talking about, it's only academics and professors at the university are developing curriculum and policymakers who are sort of swanning around at the very top that are talking about this. And when you look at the teachers, they're not in the game. They're not in it at all. And this is how it brings us to Seymour Saracen. He was a friend of David Hunt's, and so he used to come once a year to give a seminar in Oise when I was a junior professor. So I got to know him annually, so to speak. And he wrote that great book in 1972, The Culture of the School and the Problem of Change, where he said, we know two things. One, there's lots of innovations going on. And number two, teachers know about it, but they're not in on it. They're the passive recipients of other things. So that's where I came up with the concept of meaning. I said, well, they can't possibly extract any meaning because they don't play any role in shaping it. And all of a sudden it descends on them as a requirement or as an opportunity, but there's no sense of development of the sense of what it is that they should do or shouldn't do. And so it was really that part where we began to look at it more carefully. And I won't elaborate much more, but except for one thing, I did team up in the late 70s with a graduate student whose name is Alan Pomfret. And we wrote quite a good review of educational research in RER called the Curriculum Implementation Review of Research. So I had studied, so to speak, all the things that were happening, and what was happening was exactly what Seymour said. These innovations came in waves depending on the policy initiative, but they never went anywhere because teachers weren't prepared for it, they weren't interested, or if they tried to deal with it, they ended up implementing it superficially because of all those things. So that was the meaning of educational change 1982, and it was the foundation. And I hadn't at that time thought about writing more books, but that I'm going to say that nailed it because there was a lot of evidence, and it was absolutely clear that teachers had no role whatsoever in the ideas that they were expected to implement.
There's a quote in that book, and I can't remember the words exactly, but it was transformative for me. And it's the idea that when you show up and tell people what to do, after you've gone through a whole process of change and you've made your own meaning, and then you show up and just tell people what to do, it said something. It's like it's treating them like they're puppets on a string.
Yeah, that's Maris.
Right. And I remember reading that thinking, that is what I'm doing as a professional development. I'm just showing up and saying the research is done. You need to do this. And I was doing that in Southern Ontario, and my impact was I expected 100% implementation and I got 0. I used to hand out the postcards and I'd lick the stamps and I'd say, send me I had this vision of a wall filled with all these success stories on the postcards of people doing the stuff I was training them in. And after 2 years, I didn't get a single postcard back. And it's not, and they liked the stuff, but there wasn't any, they weren't involved in it. They were just passive. And many people, just because they were put in that one down position, they didn't embrace it. So that book, particularly the first chapters 3, 4, and 5, which are about constructing meaning and planning for meaning and or change, constructing change, understanding change, those were really, really, really influential in the first part. And then the second one came out. So tell us about the changes in the second edition.
Well, the first one you referred to, Maris, his name is, he wrote a book called Loss and Change, paperback, great book. And it basically says, the people who develop the innovations, they're all full of the meaning because they're developing it, and then they assume everyone else should just take their word for it and go ahead and do it. Then this was now we get into I guess each of the editions, there's about 8 years in between each, that on the average. So I kept doing the research, and we wrote a couple of the Pomfret book article came before that. But we continued to do some of the research and teaming up, and it was the same story. So when we got to the second book, it was teachers had suffered longer, so there was more evidence and more evidence of the cracks in the system. So we began to then highlight you got to pay attention to implementation, and that was then the A Nation at Risk, various foundations came out. We could cut some of it short by saying after, we'll examine some of this along the way, but mostly those, the second, third, and fourth books were around innovations being generated by commissions or the Carnegie Commission or the Nation at Risk spinoff. All of those things were coming along, and they were, when you look at it in retrospect, more of the same. They were the people, the decision makers were the politicians, some policymakers, some academics who were part of the developing the curriculum and so forth, but none of them were teachers. And so that this continued on failed implementation after failure. And I think the people at the top, the policymakers, instead of learning a lesson, being more humble and say, we don't know much, they kept pushing harder. They said, well, these teachers are so resistant. Society is failing and teachers aren't keeping up, and we keep feeding stuff for them, but they're not taking it seriously. So I think they just had the analysis wrong. And I kept hammering home at innovation. We did make some progress. Depends how far you want to jump ahead at getting better at implementation, but I'll just stop there and say, all the decades of the up until let's say the 80s, the 90s, up till 2000. I want to use 2000 as a marker for a couple of reasons when we get to it. But by the time we got to 2000, there had been these 35 years or so, 1965 to 2000, when it was just more things being attempted, but they weren't going anywhere. I remember the Holmes Group that they got involved, and then they did those 3 books, and they had great quality innovations involving teacher education, teacher professional development, but that was run by deans of education. It wasn't run by teachers, or it was run by deans of education teaming up with policy. So you have the policymakers and the academics trying to define the future. Meanwhile, the teachers suffered by neglect.
Yeah, it seems like the second edition really, I was going to sum it up, I would say there's lots of ideas, they're terribly implemented. And you have that quote by Levin and Eubanks where you talk about there isn't enough time, there isn't training, there isn't technical support, there's not leadership to support the whole thing, constraints on teachers, restrictions imposed by the school board. So it's almost, and I wrote recently about a thing called nominal change, where it's change in name only, and that's kind of what was going on. People were talking about change, but at that time, that's when I met you. Um, You pointed me towards a number of books that really shaped my thinking. Peter Senge's Fifth Discipline was one of them. Peter Block's book on consulting. It was stewardship that I read right after I talked to you that really influenced me. Margaret Wheatley's um, The New Science book about the meaning, new science and change, and chaos theory and the new science seem to really influence your thinking, along with Senge's systems thinking stuff at that time.
Yeah, I would just not to brag, but I was just on the call yesterday with Peter saying we're working together on some of the
Right.
more insightful things we'll get to later. But when I saw that work, they were enlightening. Obviously, Sengi, Margaret Wheatley, those were great ideas, but they were more critiquing the lack of attention. And what we got out of that area, and still talking before 2000, we got more attention paid to implementation. But later on, I will tell you that what it was still a top-down model. What we were trying to do then is beef up the capacity building at the level of implementation of ideas so that you got better in-service education, you got better plans some here and there to support the implementation. But the essence of it was still coming at teachers, and they were being prepared better to do it, but they weren't helping to formulate the solutions. And I'm going to say eventually that solutions were weak on nuance. By nuance, I mean understanding the context. And
Right.
because they were weak on nuance, even the good ideas didn't go anywhere because they were detached from the situation. So we can talk about 2000 when PISA started. Well, in a few minutes we can get to that. But all the way through the last century, it was uh, it was just a cumulative frustration, some good work on supporting implementation, capacity building, collaboration, stuff like that. But it was not nearly substantial enough as a norm to help with the ongoing learning and implementation that would be required eventually. So they were drops in the bucket, useful sometimes, but not going very far. And anyway, there was snippets of it. Judith Warren Little's research, Richard Elmore's research. These were things that were really great. But when I've looked at them retrospectively, I found that they were the exception. We all thought they were great, so we said, "Oh, we're getting somewhere." But then when you look closely, they were only great in small pockets.
Right.
They never connected because the system wasn't working on connection.
It seems to me like there's a few themes there, and correct me if I've got this wrong, but one of them is that change is nonlinear, and that the new science talked about how change happens in a nonlinear way. But at the same time, you didn't say just let it happen. You talked about balancing top down and bottom up in terms of change. There has to be a systemic view of what we're trying to do that acknowledges the agile nature of change, or whatever you want to call it, adaptive nature and change. In fact, Ron Heifetz is another person you pointed me to who really got me
Yeah.
thinking about adaptive change. So you have a balance of a top down and bottom up, and one without the other doesn't really get the solution. And then the other thing I think there's a couple other things, two more things I'd say that really came through during that time. One of them is that the primacy of learning, as silly as it sounds, that people need to recognize that mistakes, problems are actually good things, and people having kind of the courage to confront reality so they can move forward. And then to do that hard work of learning and working in this messy kind of change, I don't know if it's messy, but this nonlinear process of change, the only way to stay motivated is to see the moral purpose behind the work. And so you wrote several books about moral purpose at that time, which have really influenced my thinking because I really, moral purpose allows you to get beyond yourself and be a part of a system, but it also gives you the, whatever it is, inspiration, the energy to make the work happen. So all those things happened. And there's quite a few books that came out during that time: The Six Secrets of Change, Change Forces, the trilogy around change forces, some of your motion leadership, and some of those books all came together at the same time. Those were, on me, profoundly influential.
Yeah, I think one way to summarize it is we had I started to formulate two themes in parallel, but then connected. One was the Chain Forces trilogy, and the other was Moral Purpose, as you said. So the Change Forces trilogy got me into the thinking of the nonlinearity, as you pointed out, that change is a process, not an event, that all the things about problems are our friends because there's problems are encountered when you make changes. So I began to think of it, and Change Forces is about dynamic complexity, Heifetz and others. So this the dynamic complexity is the reality of complex change, and it was possible to actually make that point, the dynamic complexity, and say, well, there are ways of thinking about it that will allow you to make progress. Some of it is cognitive around the way in which change dynamics works, the Six Secrets, all of that. Toyota, several organizations that had figured it out. So some of it's cognitively helpful and powerful. And the other part is that the new driver is moral purpose, raise the bar, close the gap. So you have a goal as a driver, and you have the dynamic process, and those things went parallel for me in the late '90s up till early 2000s. They came together, and I thought that we were making progress, and we were making minor progress in retrospect. But I would say those were the two breakthroughs. They take us into the around 2000 or so, but they're not. They didn't carry the day for reasons we'll talk about in a few minutes. But at least we were getting pockets of success, and we were doing it by formulating strategies that really got at the change force dynamics, and by having it empowered by the moral purpose of why are we doing this anyways. So that looked to me at in year 2000, and I had by that time I was I think another way of slicing this is that up in the first 40 years or so, I was a researcher, getting more and more research. So by 1988 is a marker I would use. I built up the research, the knowledge, a few books by then. And then I took the job as Dean of Education at the University of Toronto, at OISE, I should say. Uh, First, I was working at OISE, working up, and then just as a practical footnote or description, OISE was the graduate school that was affiliated with the University of Toronto, and they also had a faculty of education that was a teacher education faculty, and it was sizable, over 80 faculty. The university neglected the faculty; that was just cash cow kind of thing. But eventually, they decided they had to do something about it. Again, really a political and a complex story. But the short thing is that university decided to invest in the faculty of education to build it up, and this was around 1986. And they appointed me as the first dean of the new place. The dean was the faculty. We eventually merged, which was the underlying agenda. My only point though is that particular job now, dean of education, where we had the consortium with districts, and that it got me right directly in implementing change, not studying it only. So that's how I would carve my career. First 40 years, knowing more about change and why it fails. Next 40 years, uh, 25 years, wherever you can draw the line, is getting better at implementation. So that's where I really started to learn. It's a Kurt Lewin shift. If you want to change, if you want to understand something, try changing it.
Right. That's great. Yeah, I remember when I was in that first class with you and Barry Bennett. I had no clue at what I was thinking. I remember you would. I look back at my notes and there are things like organizational culture is really important. A lot of stuff's changed. Now, that was you talk about that. The fourth edition is the hopeful period, and that's when you were working directly with the Premier of Ontario, Dalton McGuinty, and you were working, I think, with the Prime Minister in England to lead change. There was a lot of promise in that time. It looks hopeful, is the phrase he used.
Yeah, then we can grasp this now. So in retrospect, I didn't. This is how I experienced it, and I was in the dean. I made the distinction between studying change and doing change. So early 2000s, I was doing change, and that's when the Dalton McGuinty, the Premier of Ontario, came in with a education agenda. He was elected in 2003, so he came in. He said, "We'll, I want." Uh, we want to do some we want to have education as a focus, and you can have any job you want with me in the ministry. And so we decided that I would be advisor to that, but it was a very active time. And so I was increasingly hopeful in 2003 for about 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years, because we implemented using the ideas and the knowledge. It was highly successful. Literacy went up and numeracy went up. High school graduation went from 68% to 82% among the thousand schools. So it was all good. It sort of thought had arrived, and it was a matter of just being good at implementation. That was the solution. If the rude awakening, and actually awakening is the right way of doing it. You'll notice in the book that I said, okay, in 2008 or 9, by that time we felt we were on the road. California was coming to us and said, oh, we love what you're doing. They said study up groups, let's do some of that in California. So everybody was positive about implementation. And then it turned out there were a couple of hidden factors. And I called the decade 2008 to 2018. I called that decade in retrospect while we were sleeping.
Right.
And what it means is it means that there were two problems, or two neglects, that is. One is, most of us now know, thanks to the women economists like Marianne Mazzucato and Bucci, and there's about 5, 6 of them. They started to look at the changing relationship between those who had money and those who didn't. The GDP, where does it go, and that. And around that time, I guess it was about 1975 that or 80 when it started to happen. But then it exemplified the long and the short, we all know it now, is the gap between those that had money and those that didn't started to widen and widen in the US especially. So the inequality, the creeping inequality, because there was somewhat promising equality, increasing equality in the 50s and 60s. But then this other hidden factor, because we didn't analyze it this way, is that the inequality difference, especially around money, grew, and it's still growing in a negative way. So that was one thing. And then I think the other thing was that interestingly enough, that artificial intelligence was from 2008 to 2018. It developed behind the scenes. It wasn't sneaky. It was complex, I guess. It developed behind the scenes, and hardly anybody knew it, just except those that doing it. So ChatGPT came out in 2022 or whatever. It came out of nowhere. It seemed it was all of a sudden it was powerful and ubiquitous, and literally we were neglecting it. So what I knew about implementation, I'll put it this way, was eroded by the growing inequality, and was eroded by the hidden artificial intelligence that descended on the scene. People weren't capable of leveraging it for good things, and all of a sudden everything got mixed up. And at some point here, I want to say this now, that the purpose of public education got lost. I'll just leave it hanging for a moment. You will want to come back to it in some fashion. But 2008 to 2018, where I thought at the beginning of that, 2008, we've got it. We're on the right track. It's going to work. I then saw it eroded dramatically because of inequality and because of artificial intelligence not knowing what its way. Then you'll know that I wrote that what I think is a breakthrough article called "Choosing the Wrong Drivers:
Yeah, I've got it right here on my
System
screen.
Change,"
I was going to go there.
2011.
Right.
Tony Mackay from Australia commissioned it. So we named the wrong drivers there. I named the wrong drivers, and they came from the workshops I was doing in England, all across UK, Australia, New Zealand. We had done that, and we said, okay, this is not working, and the drivers are increasing accountability. The wrong drivers, technology starting to creep in, too much individualism, complex change being run from the top. All of those were the wrong drivers that I had concluded in 2011 were problematic, I wrote those with the point of, well, let's change the drivers and then we'll be okay because we know a lot. That was 2011. But then things got worse for the reasons I mentioned about inequality. So then 2011, that entire decade, that got worse and worse, as for the reasons I'm just saying. Last point. PISA, interestingly, started, first gathering of data was 2000, literacy and numeracy, math and science and literacy of reading. That got identified, quite good research by OECD, and it's revealing to note that, in the gathering of the PISA data, they gather it 1 year, and then it comes out 12 months later because it takes a lot of time to analyze the data. And then they have the next cycle 3 years later. So it goes every 3 years from 2000 onward. And what PISA shows, and Andre Schleicher, the head of PISA, says this, Pasi Sahlberg, who you and I have talked about, knows it in spades because he's inside analyzing it, is that the results have got increasingly worse from the day that PISA measured literacy and numeracy and science in 2000 to the present. Worse, 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 everywhere. And it's interesting to say, oh, why is that happening? But and we will talk about it. But I want it understood that PISA, when they got to doing their very good measures in some ways, until they got the limitations, that was supposed to be the real modern age, where now we have these great data, we could go for the whole system, and the whole system was not in the mood for change, and it got worse and worse and worse, and that's what I cover in the subsequent books, especially the sixth edition. Retrospectively, I nail that the first 20 years of this century.
I want to say a bit about the wrong drivers and then go to the sixth edition. But as I look at that wrong drivers article, I think that what I'm seeing there is it's really more about power and control than it is about changes in students guided by teachers. So well, the way we talk about coaching versus other forms of professional development, often traditional forms of professional development, an expert shows up, tells teachers what to do, says, here's what the research says. Teachers are expected to use it because research says it's good. Teachers don't really see the relevance. They might see the relevance, they might try, but their first times doing it, it's kind of awkward. And the easiest thing to do is just drift back to the way you used to teach. And then sometimes what happens is the system steps up accountability. We're going to do walkthroughs, make sure you've got your success criteria on the board. It has to be there. And that kind of poisons the culture and people aren't really happy about it. And then eventually something else comes along and you never get to deep levels of change. We start with kids. So we say, let's have the teacher learn how to analyze what's happening with the kids with respect to engagement, well-being, and achievement. Give them tools to analyze. That's the book Data Rules is about that. Once the teacher is looking at what's happening with the kids in partnership with a coach who doesn't silence herself, but also sees the other person, it's a Sengi, it goes back to Sengi, but they engage in a dialogical back and forth conversation. Two professionals engage in a conversation, not someone talking down to the other person. So they set a goal. Then the coach has expertise, but they don't act like an expert. So what they do is they say, well, maybe the person already knows what to do. So they say, you've probably thought a lot about this. What do you think you might do? And if they have a good idea, run with it. But if they're like, I came to you because I don't know what to do, then the coach draws on their expertise and says, well, here's a number of possibilities. And then they help them implement, and then you get into an adapt because it's not going to work. The first time you try it out, 9 times out of 10, it needs some adaptations or it might be the wrong strategy. Now, taking that and fitting it into a system model is where I see a huge piece we have to look at, because as you put in your wrong drivers, just focusing on the individual isn't enough. It has to be individual in the system. But to me, when I look at those drivers, it's all about you need to learn technology. We're going to have accountability. And really, I think you need to start with kids and work backwards from the kids. And you can do that by having a coach who's also aware of the vision for change within the whole system.
Yeah.
And look at other ways of establishing connections. But anyway, that's what you did to me there with that one. Has got me thinking about, let's start with kids instead of starting with authority, I guess.
That's good. That's good. I want to throw a monkey wrench into that. I want to agree
I
with
knew
you
you would.
first. agree with you first and then give you a monkey wrench. The agreement is it is all about power that way, and that the implementers were out of power and the wrong people were in power, and that's why it didn't work. And what you were able to do was make up for that by shifting the power and having coaching come from the bottom and the middle. My monkey wrench or the teasing part of it is if you do coaching very well, the way you do, and you've described it, that's necessary but not sufficient. And it's necessary. The reason it's not sufficient is that it can lead to people getting better at the wrong game. And the wrong game is academic obsession. The wrong game is literacy, numeracy as exclusive. And what and so I want it's a nuanced point because it's not just straightforward, flat out the way I said it. But this is why I want to take your word power and say that's exactly right. But I want to add purpose and revisit the purpose of education,
Right.
which has led us to be less academically obsessed because of the dysfunctions of that, and more around the child with, in terms of the, well, in our case, the global competencies. So I
Right.
think I just want to underscore this with one other statement, jumping way ahead. Richard Elmore, who was a hero of the right solution and had really spent the time in the classrooms and really had the analysis. He gave a very long interview in January 2021, a podcast. And in it, he said, public education has lost its sense of purpose. And it is, it doesn't any longer have that sense. The word he used was public education has become obsolete. That was his word. And then he went on to say, people, that is students and even teachers, are not going to stand for it. This, I'm quoting him. They're not going to stand for it. They will just walk away.
Mm,
He died a month later.
mm.
That was he had been so discouraged by because he knew what the solution was. He had done it in some small pockets, but he didn't. He knew it also he was losing the game was being lost because of the consequences of the system with its the other things I mentioned about the inequality and the lack of focus on the right things. So here's where I want to say where we are now, and I take it up in the last chapter in the epilogue of the book. We have to repurpose education around developing students who are good in society and good for society. That's one of those goals. Anaheim is the best example I know because we're working with them intimately, and we're doing that. So there's still this figuring out. I think it is a difficult thought as to how do you still recognize that literacy and numeracy is vital, but don't get lost up into the obsession of that where you're trying to work with students in a way that they don't find it relevant to their life and where they are, and that therefore they I feel safe in saying, accurate in saying, by the time they get to grade 11, about 80% of students, I mean 80%, don't find education very purposeful for themselves, on the average 80%. So anyway, that's where I think the new stuff has to attack that problem.
It's not really a monkey wrench because I think we're on the same page. I mean, I ask myself or have asked others, how would schools be different if we measured love of learning and self-efficacy and joy
Mm-hmm.
uh, and self-regulation as carefully as we measure reading and math skills? I think that if the light was shining on those aspects of children and not just on achievement. So we really believe lack of engagement is the reason kids drop out. Research is pretty clear. Kids drop out because they don't feel connected with school. So if they can feel connection, um, they're going to learn more, but there's a lot more to school than just learning. So I like the way that you put that.
I just reached for this book just to confirm what you just said. The
Uh-huh.
disengaged, right? You
Right.
found the disengaged teen chapter
I can't
verse
see that.
exactly what you said.
Who's the author? I can't see the author.
Jenny Anderson and Rebecca Winthrop, their Brookings Institute is
Oh,
Rebecca.
wow.
So
Great.
this is empirical data in spades. So I think it absolutely confirms what you just said. The question is, what is the motivational connection to doing something about that people will rally about. Like sometimes you call it the North Star, whatever. So
Right.
I think we're stuck right now where literacy and numeracy, the old agenda is clearly specific enough to name, but the new agenda of engagement is a lot fuzzier to name than literacy and numeracy. And that's where I think we're stuck. Love of learning, I agree with you, all of that. But how to make it purposeful, how to make it sticky for implementers, how to make it attractive for policymakers. That's where we are in 2025.
Mm, yeah. Um, so tell me about the sixth edition. Let's, as much as I want to pursue that further, tell me about some of the things in the sixth edition and looking ahead, what you see in the future for educational change.
Yeah, the first conclusion I made before I got to the positive was that if you take 1965 to 2024, that 35, 45, 55, 60 years, that there is no serious success of system change anywhere in the world. There is a pile of failures everywhere in the world, and literally there's no success of school systems. And I have the data, and we have the data. And I don't, sometimes there's a blip. We had in Ontario for that 6 years, went up, but it receded. It's gone down everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. That tells me two things. One is very hard to do. And the second is we're not doing it the right way. So our recent work then is to redefine what the right way is. And I think it means an absolutely transformative change in the culture of teaching and in the culture of student role learning. Those two things. I mean a comprehensive change. I mean everywhere. And what we are doing now, I get into the analysis in the especially the last chapter, which is chapter seven, eight, so eight probably, and then I have also an extended epilogue. Say, okay, here, what's the problem here? So I think that's where we stand, and I think it's what we have in Anaheim and a bunch of others. We just studied 6 districts in California. Anaheim was one, 5 additional ones on high school, which is the hardest one nut to crack. And we studied 6 that had some success, good success, age 12 to 18. And we said these 6, and this I did it with Sarah. Sarah Fine is one of my people, my researchers, so to speak. She did the book with Jal Mehta on deeper learning.
Right.
Santiago Rincon Gallardo works with me. So what we found were the threads of success were more essence that we ended up naming. Sorry, I'm just looking around. Shared vision, these are interactive. Shared vision, what we call systemness. It's when students and teachers identify with the system, not systemic like Peter Senge, but systemness like subjective. Steady work, they stayed at it, they kept getting better, and symmetry, that symmetry among the pieces, etc. So I think that gives us a big hint about where things need to be orchestrated. It's more sophisticated. It's easier to say, "Wow, we've got to boost literacy and numeracy," but it's much harder to take those 4 S's. And what we are doing now, and it's in the book, you saw it. I said, I want to turn the system on its head and say, you need to build the bottom, strengthen the middle, and intrigue the top. And so that's what we're doing. Intrigue the top is deliberately playful. We want them to partner, but the top has failed time and again, and they haven't learned from what they failed. They change over every 4 or 8 years, so there's no continuity, and they just haven't got the sophistication of doing this. Now we're beginning to see, in the case of aspects of California, that the certainly the districts are learning something differently, that they have to work with their schools differently. So that's bottom and middle getting better. And even the top now, that they're beginning to question, well, our policies of strengthening capacity building, trying to go low on compliance. But then we find, I'm talking California, we find, well, we have strengthened capacity building, but it's not taking hold, and actually compliance is not going away. We keep inadvertently or otherwise using it. So it's kind of in between the future. And now I think we have to come to grips with what is the compelling North Star and purpose of education in 2025 and onward. What is it? And you can give me a good philosophical or otherwise answer about what it should be, but I want you to be able to do it and to say, okay, I've captured it, and you know what? It's sticky, it's specific, it's attractive. We can do this because now we can get clarity, and we can go from moral purpose to what we now call spirit work.
Mm, that's great. Yeah, it seems to me that the shared vision uh, contains shared purpose,
Yeah.
but also cultural norms. It's about a culture. You walk into the building and you feel this is a different place, and there's a way in which people respectfully interact and a focus on learning in the culture. But that culture is fired up by the purpose of
Yeah,
treating.
I mean, we only have five things in our model, but just let's take the
Right.
logic of this. Shared purpose could be the big omnibus driver. And then you add culture, and that's now you get into the means of making the purpose come alive.
Right.
So those are two of our five elements of the model. So we don't have like a 20 item model, but what you've got to get the purpose and then the culture moving in the same direction, feeding on each other, and then you have to sharpen the actual specifics of the what the culture does and how do you measure. We're spending a lot of time on measuring progress now, not for accountability but for clarity.
Yeah. This is another conversation we'll have to have because I think you won't be surprised to hear that my perspective is our work addresses that. But by focusing on kids, that gives us a built-in measure of effectiveness. And we say there has to be a direct line from what the coach does to the output. But the output could be about well-being. It could be about engagement. It could be about achievement. It's a universal model for change.
Yeah,
And
no, I agree. Yep.
the goal you said is the way you do it. But I think with what I like about what you're saying with culture, what I'm learning leading our little company is it has to narrow down to a few simple things. It has to
Mhm.
come down to, for us, it's keep kids first. It's we are learners and we honor the person not in the room. Those kind of cultural norms, we're appreciative in our ways of interacting. And you have to keep coming back to them over and over and over again and watch for examples to celebrate them and then in quiet but clear ways, recognize when it's not happening and address it. You have to keep coming back to it all the time
Mhm.
for the culture.
I totally agree with. I think you've got it actually because I get snippets of what you're doing, but I only have one other criterion I want to push you on.
Right.
And this is this, that the minimum unit of change is more than one district. The minimum is not even one district. Like you can say, okay, schools did this. The step before the minimum is the entire district. The step after the minimum is two or more districts working. And then, of course, I want the whole system. But as long as we just look at maximum one district at a time, we'll never get anywhere unless there are multiples working, because that's how the thing spreads.
Yeah, you're gonna have to teach me about that one. I have to learn more
Well, you're
because
going to teach
my
us.
minimum is one classroom. So,
Well, yeah. So that's not going to add up, right?
right, right, right. Well,
Yeah.
it's the kids in that class.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure. But we no, you
anything.
can actually you can take your work and you actually I think can leverage the impact because it's a small number. It's as you said, it's getting a small number of things right and
Right.
staying with them. And if you do that, you can change the world
Yeah.
because somebody else said that.
Well, you have. So
Yeah,
there you.
well, somebody before me,
Right.
Mag Whately probably.
Right.
Uh, Mead
Um.
Mead said that.
Right.
Yeah.
So, any last thoughts about looking ahead? What you see looking ahead, Michael?
Yeah, I think I really do think, because we're seeing it in California now, that people are getting the point I made about doing those things we're talking about, things that you would, Jim, really value and name, but doing them where they show up in the whole district, and more than that, in the multiple districts when we see them learning from each other. And they're one of the things they're doing in California. They just established a new initiative. This is not the government, although they might do this. It's called RISE, RISE, and it's a redesign of this or that. But basically, it's generating a pool of leaders who will do the new thing and have it as a pipeline or whatever for the future, and cultivating a group of leaders that learn stuff together. And then when they become a superintendent 2 years later, they build on that, and you keep building on it. So that's California, and I think I think we need to do that. I think the kind of absolute mess that the U.S. is in now is a function of failure for 50 years or whatever timeline you want to take. It's failed so much that it allows somebody like Trump to come in and declare it a total failure and try to fix it in the wrong way. So I think there's that danger, but I think what we will see and what I'm going to say is the goal. In the next 3 years, we have to do what we should have done before, which was put into place the things that I've been describing that will start to get success at the aggregate level, two or more districts, more and more like that, and that will turn it around because it was obviously what we don't have right now. We don't have a system that's based on the humanity paradigm. We have the opposite. And so humans cannot stay evolved and increase more if the humanity paradigm is not the governing concept.
Mhm. Yeah, it's well, yeah, technical solutions to adaptive challenges for sure. Thank you so much, Michael. It's been such a pleasure. I'm
Well, sorry, we're a bit rambly, but I know what you know, so a lot of the things you know, and we always bring out the best in the conversation. So we have to make a date to do more because I think there's going to be more action in the next 12 months, 36 months. But let's take it step at a time. And I'd love to talk to you more about what you're doing and how it can spread.
well, I'd love that. We'll set up another conversation, but um, back to the beginning.
Yep.
Know you, know me. I'm profoundly grateful. Have always been grateful that you took when I walked in, no clue what I was doing. Writing down culture is important in my notes. You took the time to meet with me, and we met many times. I don't think you got any benefits for it beyond being my teacher. So I'm very, very grateful, and it continues today. I was shaped by today's conversation too. So thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate it, and I appreciate also knowing you and people like you because my whole career is fueled by what I learned from leading practitioners, and I consider you to be one of them. So it goes two ways.
Thank you.